me. So the recording is on. I'll be making this recording available later today to the rest of the section. Today I'm going to start on Chapter 6, Social Stratification. In many ways, social stratification is the central phenomenon around which the teaching of sociology in North America anyway is organized. Social inequality is the starting point of sociology as a university discipline, and so for that reason, and in that way, stratification represents the kind of central reality around which sociology is organized. And really, there are two options available to sociology as a discourse, as a discipline, as a research program, and as a course, as a way of thinking that students are introduced to at the university. And that is, on the one hand, that social inequality is inevitable to some degree. That's one option. And the other one is that social inequality is not inevitable. And to the degree that it's not inevitable, then it has to be fixed. It has to be addressed. Now, it doesn't automatically follow from the claim that social inequality can be fixed, that it has to be completely eradicated. And that's the starting point of today's course. It need not follow empirically. Just because there's a problem, it doesn't automatically follow that we can fix it. It does, though, automatically follow from certain kinds of problems that we have a responsibility to try to fix it. And that's the case even if we don't already know ahead of time what it would look like when it was fixed. What I mean by that is, and what sociologists mean by that, with respect specifically to social inequality, is that in order to completely eradicate social inequality, we'd have to know two arguably different things that we don't yet know. Inequality of what, on the first, and secondly, related but not the same thing, what is equality? So we'd have to decide equality of what, and then we'd need to figure out, well, what is equality going to look like? I want to walk through that last part of that second thing just for a minute so that we can get our heads around this. It might seem pretty clear what equality would look like. Everyone would have an equal share. But is there a problem with that? Is there a conceptual problem with arguing that social equality would demand that everybody has an absolutely equal share of all the goods that are available in society? Well, let's think about specific goods and see what that kind of a distribution would amount to. So let's just take food as an example. If everybody on Earth, if social equality dictated that everybody would have the same share of food, would that result in the ideal society? Why not? That's right, Noor. That's where I'm going with this. But in what ways might this not be an ideal distribution? Well, but why? So it's important when we're thinking about this to distinguish between why we want equality and what it is we mean when we say we have equality. Granted, so I mean, among other things, uh, who says hard work is a good thing? I mean, you might think that, I might think that, but it's not immediately, it's not self-evidently obvious that hard work is the only measure. But where I'm going with this is that an equal distribution, an absolutely equal distribution, first of all, how would you determine what an equal distribution of food looks like? Would it be total number of calories? Would it be total number of X, Y, or Z? It's not immediately clear what total equality of a resource would look like. And secondly, it's not even clear that it makes sense. If so let's say we took 1,000 Canadians, or let's say we took all Canadians. There are some Canadians who are 4-month-old babies. In an equal society, would it make sense for that 4-month-old baby to have the same amount of food in one day as it would for me, a grown man? Uh, no, it wouldn't make sense. And so we have to start right away. We're faced with an empirical question of proportionality, separately from the much more complicated notion that Noor introduced, a legitimate, important, crucial notion, but it's conceptually speaking downstream from this initial or this other problem, this other conceptual challenge. What does equality really look like? It's not immediately obvious, and many of the different proposals present problems. And so the main point I want to talk about is social inequality, but I want all of us to be clear that social inequality, when it's a problem, includes with it thinking through what kinds of solutions we're going to bring to the problem of social inequality. And so in this case, one of the reasons that social inequality is a non-social reason, that social inequality is in many ways at the center of the social sciences and a social science education, is that it's so readily quantifiable. And so it's a very good topic for many of the methodology courses. And in a social science degree, most social science degrees require of a student to have at least one statistics course, and social inequality is largely organized around statistical information. And in this case, it's no different. So we're going to take a look at some of that data. And to do that, I'm going to turn to my PowerPoint presentation. So now, is the slide on the screen? Thank you. So what is social stratification? Social inequality, what is that? So social stratification is defined in our chapter as the organization of society into layers or strata reflecting the hierarchical structures of class and status. So the key thing is here that the layers are, in a sense, horizontal, not vertical. And so social stratification means that there's a higher and lower levels within a given society. And from a certain understanding of how of what this imposes on social science as a discipline. Some social scientists insist that there's no pre-given necessity to map a normative framework onto these layers, so that we don't automatically, there's no mathematical, there's no logical necessity in associating the top level with the best. We can just say, and we'll look in a minute at the vocabulary, but if we divide Canadian society into incomes, and so we have the top 20%, the second 20%, the third, fourth, and fifth 20%. The top income is the result of a mathematical operation on a data set, and same with the second and third and fourth and fifth. And mathematically speaking, there's no difference between them outside of the formulas that are used to transform that data. But there's a giant gap between that approach to social science and the reality of the experience of being in one of those groups. And so there's tension, there's a problem at work within the social sciences in how it is that we go about understanding what it is that this mathematical analysis of this data delivers to us. Now, the application of mathematics and statistics to the data produces a lot of very powerful information. But for today, for sure, mostly what I'm going to try to do is get through to begin our reflection on the large-scale conceptual distinctions that are drawn. And so we have societies, modern societies for sure, and many sociologists believe at least in some ways, all human societies have always been stratified to a greater or lesser degree. Now, the last terminological point I want to call to your attention is this claim that there's a hierarchical structure involved in these strata. And that is a normative claim, and it need not be an assumption. A great deal, virtually all of the data demonstrates this hierarchical nature of these strata. Hierarchical simply means ordered from top, basically ordered from top to bottom. And we'll see what that looks like. So in the textbook, the example that the author uses to illustrate this has to do with the Titanic, the transatlantic ship that sank on its first passage, and it was a luxury ship, and so it had built into it class differences, income differences, and let me just make it bigger so that I can see it. And what you get here is that the rich survived more than the poor on this ship, and that is intended to be a kind of graphic depiction of how of the consequences of class in society. So here the metaphor, the intention of this metaphor is to demonstrate the extent to which class determines outcomes, determines is too strong a term, how class correlates with outcome in certain instances, in many instances actually. In a day, in a week, in a month, in a year of COVID, we know from the news and perhaps even from personal experience, that in some ways, in many ways, class is one of the vectors that unequally distributes the negative consequences of COVID. We know, for example, in Toronto, that neighborhoods that have lower standard incomes, lower median incomes rather, have higher instances of COVID and have higher mortality rates of COVID. Why there's this correlation is what the bulk of this chapter is intended to look at. Not the answer to why, but at the different options that are taken up by sociologists to formulate those questions and to set up standards to which the different approaches are going to be held. So in order to be able to get through that, we need to take a look at some vocabulary here. When we're talking about inequality in Canadian society and in most contemporary societies, what we're talking about are resources, and by and large, what that means is wealth. And when social scientists talk about wealth, what they mean in that respect, they borrow vocabulary from economics. And what they're talking about with wealth is assets minus liabilities. So, in many ways, the standard example that is used would be, and I want to discuss why it's a standard example and what the fact that it's a standard example tells us about sociology in a minute. But let's walk through that standard example. The standard example that's often described in a sociology class is the wealth would be the total value of the home that you own minus how much you still owe on your mortgage. So if you live in a home that's worth, I think the average home in Toronto now is worth, let's say for the sake of argument, $1 million. But some people have moved into that home. Some families have moved into that home and owe a large mortgage on it, whereas other families have lived there for years and years and they've paid off their mortgage. So the home itself, both homes are worth $1 million, but in one case they still have 15 years of a mortgage to pay off, and in the other case they have paid off their mortgage. So clearly the family that's paid off their mortgage, they have $1 million in assets, whereas the family that has just taken on that mortgage, they don't have $1 million in wealth. They have $1 million minus whatever is left for them to pay on their mortgage. Now, okay, well, I'll just go to the next slide in order to make my point about what does that tell us, that that's the standard example. What that tells us is this is who goes to university. So that to the degree that that is the standard example offered in university classes to a classroom, what that tells us is that it's these people. So the top quintile, the top 20% section of net worth in Canadian families, they're worth, in 1999, the data shows that they were worth $3 million. Now, and then the next one is here, but the two bottom, so the 40% of the families in Canada and unattached individuals in Canada, they're worth $0.2 million and minus $0.003 million. So at the bottom, these people don't own their own home. People from this section don't own their own home. And my main point is that the social sciences, being a university, being a post-secondary institution discourse, are themselves populated by, at the faculty level for sure, but also even disproportionately compared to the rest of Canadian population, they're populated primarily by people from these demographics. Now, increasingly over this very time period, probably starting a little earlier, for a number of reasons, many of them the result of government approaches to addressing different problems that arise, different social problems that arise as a result of social inequality, have pursued a strategy of expanding the people who go to post-secondary education. College and university is widely believed by governments and widely believed by the people who run those very institutions, and by me, by the way, also, to be what the best, not perfect, but the best available solution to address many of the problems of social inequality. So what I'm saying is, or what I'm trying to say anyway, is that college and university, where social inequality is studied, is itself an unequal institution in terms of the demographics of the people who make it up, who compose it, who work here and who produce this knowledge and who reproduce this knowledge and who teach and also who study it. Now, so just so we're clear, of course, there are people from all 5 of these groups in the faculty at Seneca College, and there are people from all 5 of these groups in the student population, but they're not distributed across the faculty, and they're not distributed across the student population in a way that mirrors how they're distributed in Canadian society. The college is not a mirror of Canadian society, the student population, nor the faculty. And so there's a possibility that fact has an impact on the approaches that are taken and the knowledge that's produced in those institutions. So I just want to alert you to that reality. So let's go back here. So now when we talk about social inequality, as we'll see next week, the different theories evaluate in different ways how central to a full understanding of how central to a full understanding of social inequality wealth is. And so by and large, sociology is committed to a theoretical distinction between wealth and power. And almost all sociologists of whatever theoretical inclination and commitment acknowledge that there's relative autonomy in terms of impact on society between wealth and power. So what that means, roughly speaking, is that there are people who have a great deal of power, but not so much wealth. There are some very powerful people who have a lot of power in society without necessarily having a lot of wealth. Even though there are not that many people, if any, who have a lot of wealth without having also a lot of power. So there's an asymmetry between wealth and power, but by and large, sociologists are committed to the acknowledgement of what is a fact, really, that there are some people who have power without necessarily having wealth. They have influence, and the definition of power that is typically used to start down this road is from Weber, and that is the ability to achieve one's goals even against the resistance of others. The advantages of wealth are too obvious to be able for it to be worth discussing. So the key conceptual challenge is to be able to see how this distinction works between wealth and power. What would it? What is it? The main point is that wealth is, I mean, essentially the main point is that wealth is not everything, that it is entirely possible. So in some sense, the example we could have is Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They're both wealthy people by normal standards, by the standards. If we had the US version of this data, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden would be part of this top 20% of American population. But Donald Trump almost certainly has more wealth than Joe Biden does. But Joe Biden was able to become president against Donald Trump, so that Donald Trump's considerable wealth advantage was not enough to overcome Joe Biden's whatever it is that power is, wherever that ability comes from, and that's a complicated matter and a conceptually difficult matter. Nonetheless, it seems to be the case. Everybody in sociology, virtually everybody in sociology, acknowledges that there are power effects in society. Okay, so now. So I want to take a look at this chart so that we can get an idea of what the wealth disparities look like. And then once we've taken a look at wealth disparities, I want to come back to the key conceptual challenge, and that is to understand power versus wealth. So in Canada, over the 17-year period between 1999 and 2016, what this chart shows, what this chart tracks, is the data that's been accumulated. And if you scroll down, it says, and this is a key methodological consideration that to keep in mind, what is the source? And so the source, Bob Brim, turned to Statistics Canada. Statistics Canada get their information by legislation. The Canadian government runs Statistics Canada. Statistics Canada operates from the federal budget, and the federal government gives Statistics Canada the legislative, the legal authority to collect data. In some ways, controversially, still, it collects data, some of it directly from the Ministry of Revenue. It's not even called that anymore. I forget what the name of the ministry is, but in any event, although this data is not absolutely perfect, Statistics Canada has available to it income tax information. And so while this won't include absolutely 100% of all of the wealth of all of the people in Canada, it does give us a very, very good snapshot of most of the economic activity, most of the wealth activity and income activity in Canada. And especially for this group here, the very wealthy have available to them legitimate and illegitimate means to hide some of this wealth, and or to, I mean, their wealth is not quite as transparently. Wealth is not just a bunch of gold coins in a bag. The very wealthy, the value of their assets and even the location of their assets is difficult to be sure about. They have money in stocks and bonds that are in banks in other countries in order to decrease their tax exposure and so on. But by and large, this gives us a scale of the thing. And what we see that the clearest, what this graph, the purpose of this graph is to demonstrate to us that the gap between the top 20% already in 1999, there was a very, very considerable gap between the top 20% and the rest of Canadian population. The top 20% had a net value in 1999 of $3 million. By the year 2016, the top 20% looks different. So now this is the top 20% of incomes, not of people. And so some of the people who were in this top 20%, well, let me start over. Many of the people who were in this top 20% it's the same people over here. They were able to, for a number of different reasons, maintain their wealth all the way along here. But some people lost their wealth under whatever different kinds of circumstances. And so if they spent their money poorly, or if they invested unwisely, or X, Y, or Z, then their net value might have plummeted to zero. And there might be some people who in 1999 had a net value of $3 million, but by 2005 are down here or here or here. So what this tracks, it doesn't track people, it tracks amount of money. So what they do is they basically take the income tax returns and they take a look at the amount of money, not the names on there, and they just take the pile of the top 20% of income tax earners, of income earners from the income tax, because you have to also list on your income tax the value of your assets. And so they're able to take a look at what the top 20%, whoever they might turn out to be, what they're worth, and what percentage they have of the total worth of the Canadian economy. And so in 2016, the top 20% of the net worth individuals and families represented 67.3% of the total value of the Canadian economy. So that the rest of the Canadian population had to split between them 31 or 32.7% of the Canadian of the value of the Canadian economy. So this second tier closely approximates what a mathematically equal distribution across the whole population would look like. So the second tier has 20% of the population and, roughly speaking, 20% of the economic value of the Canadian economy. But the bottom 60%, they're well below what that statistical median would look like. So this gap here is enormous, and this is what social inequality looks like. But it's this change that is especially noteworthy. Between the year 2000 and the year 2016, in absolute terms, the gap between the very richest and the rest of the Canadian population has expanded tremendously. And so it's not just that there's a great deal of social inequality in Canadian society overall, it's that the extent of inequality has increased tremendously. If all three, so part of this is because the Canadian economy has grown quite a bit in this time period. And so if all of these curves had gone up, if all of the net worths had gone up at the same rate, then this gap would have stayed the same. but it hasn't. What happens is that the very bottom quintile, has stayed flat and is in fact diminished a little bit. The bottom 20% of the Canadian population owes money, has less. Their liabilities are greater than their assets, and the bottom 40% are, roughly speaking, almost just treading water, in the sense that the value of their assets is, roughly speaking, equal to the value of their debts. So we live in an unequal society. Now, in a second, I'm going to take a look at another chart, but wealth is not the primary, or is not the sole measure of the kinds of assets that go into describing social inequality. For most of us, that is, most people in Canada, their wealth is dictated by the amount of money that they earn, by their income. And most Canadians' income comes from where? Where do most Canadians get their income? Right, exactly. So for most Canadians, it's our jobs that provide us with our incomes. But where else can income come from? Exactly. So, roughly speaking, the two main sources of incomes in the Canadian economy are uh, employment income and investment income. And for most Canadians, a great deal of their income, actually, for most Canadians, all of their income comes from their employment. But for the wealthy, their income regularly exceeds how much they have to spend to get through their daily, so they can save money, and they put their money in the bank, or typically um, they put their money also in investments, and in that way their money makes money. They don't just make money from their jobs, they also make money uh, from investing that money in the capitalist economy, and they get a return on that money. And in fact, the very wealthy, they make more money from that kind of wealth generating income compared to their jobs. In fact, many of the very wealthiest don't even have jobs anymore. They don't have to they don't put on a hard hat in the morning and pack a lunch in their suitcase or in their lunch box. It's their money that makes money for them, and we'll see there are different descriptions of that fact. And in Canada and in many, many countries around the world, governments operate based on tax that's raised from income. And so in Canada, for most jobs, for all legal jobs anyway, you are required to, above a certain amount, after you've earned a certain amount of money, you're required to pay a percentage of that money to the government, and that's called income tax. So that's after tax income is the amount of money earned after deducting from that money the income tax that's owed. And so what you have is it's the amount of money earned in a given period after paying income tax and receiving government benefits. And so so the government benefits that are included there are employment insurance, child tax credits, GST credits, and welfare payments. And so these are sources of revenue, sources of income that the government gives to some citizens, and the calculation of after-tax income is in many ways the clearest indication of your socioeconomic status in Canada in a neutral kind of sense. Now I want to take a look at another chart here. Where the gap, it's unfortunate the year-to-year comparison isn't the same, but the time gap is even broader, so we get a different kind of explanation, or description rather. So if we take a look at the difference between, I'm gonna have to shrink this a bit. The share of annual after-tax income between 1976 and 2011, here the gap hasn't changed very much at all. The top quintile of the Canadian population accounted for after-tax income. Here the increase was only, in fact, it shrunk by 1%. But what that tells us, so what's the difference then? We take a look at these two charts. There's this giant gap here, and the slope is massive, huge increase. But if we go back to this one, it's the second group that seems to have improved its position. No, wait a minute. No, the top, the top has only grown by 3.3%. The bottom has shrunk a tiny bit, and so where we have our differences is here. What does this tell us? What does the pie show about Canadian society? Well, one version of it is easier to see in this graph. Income inequality across households, so that's unattached individuals and families, has roughly speaking flattened since, basically flattened compared to the previous period. But what this doesn't show, and what this leaves open to competing and very different kinds of interpretation, is the impact of the tax regime on the accumulation of wealth and the gap between total wealth and the share that income plays in the accumulation of wealth. The bottom line is that the serious money, the real wealth, is not generated through employment income. Employment income has, roughly speaking, stabilized across most families, and it's other kinds of income that are really generating this difference in wealth. One of the most shocking components, or one of the most shocking factoids that is often cited in the press around how COVID has spotlighted social inequality. Here it's the US context, but it's a global reality, is that apparently over in the year and a bit since COVID started, Jeff Bezos's wealth has shot up astronomically as a result of the increased business that Amazon is doing, but also as a result of his other investments. The value of the U.S. stock market has gone up and up and up. I mean, not up every single day, but over the course of the year, the U.S. stock market has increased in value considerably over this time period, even though many, many people have lost their jobs, even though many, many people, even though the US economy itself shrunk, The value of the wealth of the people at the very, very top has increased enormously. And it's not as though Jeff Bezos got a second job. It's not as though Jeff Bezos is doing more work. What he's done is he's accumulated more wealth. And so what we're looking at in the period between 2000 and 2020 is it's called in the social sciences the financialization of the global economy. The global economy has been transformed over the last 50, 70 years or so from a manufacturing, a goods producing economy to a financialized economy. And we'll examine that in a little bit more detail next week and the week after. So now, what accounts for what are the different explanations that are available to describe how it is? Let's go back to this chart here. What are the people in this group doing differently than the people in this group and the people in this group and the people in this group? What factors explain the difference in 1999 and the difference between 1999 and 2016? I'm asking, what do you think are the differences between what the people are doing here? Almost everybody in all of these groups would like to have would like to have this amount of money. Now maybe none of you would, but I'm pretty sure I would. I would like to be. I'm not in this group, but I would like to have that kind of money, or I can easily imagine all of the advantages to having all that money, but I don't. And some of you might, maybe all of you have, maybe none of you have. But those of us who don't can easily enough imagine that what the advantages are to having that kind of money or this kind of money. But what the chart tells us is only 20% of the people in Canada have this kind of money, and 80% of us are down here. What's the difference between what are these people doing that's different from what the rest of us are doing? What kind of resources? But better, but how do connections? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. But so we'll get back to trust funds for starting businesses in a second. Networks are resources. There's very little doubt about that anymore. It took a while for social scientists to be able to develop a theoretical and empirically sophisticated model for quantifying and demonstrating the actual impact of networks, but that's done. It's now widely acknowledged that the richness, the thickness of your network at least correlates very well with this. That's right. The people up here network with each other, and that's one of the resources they have that allows them to stay here, and one of the resources that allows them to go from here to here. But how? What is it about having a network of a certain kind, of a different kind than the network that the rest of us have, that allows them to pile up their money? Alternative. So that's one set of questions sociologists ask. Another set of questions is, so let's say that's true. Uh, how do you break into that network? Because although we're going to, as we'll see next week, uh, the extent to which the people who were here are the same people who were here. It's not 100%, but there's a great deal of continuity in who is part of this. And so once you're in the network, the value, the effectiveness of being in that network in maintaining your advantages is established. It's notable. It's clear. Nonetheless, some people with access to that network nonetheless lose their fortunes. And probably more significantly, some people who don't start out as part of that network figure out a way to get into that network. And so in 1999, there are some people who were in the bottom quintile who by the year 2016 are in this group. How do you get into a network? Another set of questions. But the point is, if you already had power and influence, how is it you ended up down here? So it's once you're in the network, that gives you power and influence, and that's very valuable. But how do you go about getting in that network? How do you go from a position of less power and influence to more power and influence? It's easy enough to imagine once you're in there, how you stay in there. What's harder to imagine and harder to understand and harder to describe. Right, but smart decisions, what does that mean? Sure, but what's a smart decision? What's not a smart decision? So what does making better business choices have to do with a network? So yes. So now you invest your income, but if you don't have income to invest, so how you stay rich is less puzzling than how you go from not rich to being rich. And so once you have a lot of money, if your net worth is $3 million, then you're paying your rent, you're paying all your bills, you've got money left over at the end of every 2 weeks that you can then invest, and you can just pay someone else to invest that money, and that money will just grow. Probably not that fast, but it'll grow at some speed, and so you can still stay in the group without bothering too much about it. Roughly speaking, you can hire someone in this group to babysit your money and make sure that your money keeps you in this growing group. But how do you get to having enough income that you can save money at the end of 2 weeks? So let's see. So I want to just take a look here at the. So disruption, yes, there we go. This is one of those words that drives me crazy. But to get in, you disrupt their source of income until there's less risk for them if they include you as one of them. So I don't really understand exactly what that means. That sounds more like a movie script than a business plan. Although there's overlap there for sure. Well, let's take a look at what the typical. I'm surprised and kind of relieved here. Uh, so typically speaking, sort of the received wisdom in bourgeois society is that what dissociates. So Elon Musk uh, got an engineering, or he went to Queen's University, then he transferred somewhere else. I forget where he transferred to, but he worked. Supposedly, he had a good idea, and he got an education, and he worked hard. And the typical story is that in order to get ahead, you have to work hard. And so, um, Kandekar suggested you have to cut off expenses, but at the bottom here, there's no cutting off expenses. It's not as though the people who are in this bottom uh, quintile, these two bottom quintiles, uh, have to give up their Mercedes, or there's no fat down here. These people up here, they don't get to. They're not primarily accumulating savings after expenses just by tightening their belts. Now, you can move upwards a little bit by doing that, but mostly what you need to do is get a better paying job. And that's mostly how networks help. Network theory, in fact, was developed by people who were researching how is it that how our jobs in practice actually landed, and they studied and they took a look at people who graduate from prestige universities with credentials in in-demand fields, and it still turns out that if you graduate with a degree in the US, is where it started. If you graduate with a degree from a prestige university in a high demand field, your background still is a better predictor of where you're going to get a job and what your income will be 5 years after graduation than, strictly speaking, the credential you got. So if you graduated with an MBA from Harvard, and you don't have connections, you're less likely to land that high paying job on Wall Street than if you graduate from Harvard with an MBA and you do have those connections. But if you graduate from Harvard with a degree in poetry, you're less likely to get a job on Wall Street making hedge fund, whatever. And so it's not enough to just be born rich in order to get ahead. You also need to learn from, and you need to participate in society and in the economy of that society in order to continue to participate in that increase in wealth at the top. Now, just one second here. And then the other feature that is characterized sociology is so sociology has been split in two, and it's been, I think, in a way, in a helpful way, obsessed, but we'll take a look at that and probably not. Poverty has been a real concern of sociology. The reality, the issue, the dynamics of poverty have been a real concern for sociologists. And in an era of growing income inequality, the persistence of poverty in rich societies poses a problem, and is acknowledged to pose a problem from a number of different points of view. And poverty, in a way, in a mirror kind of fashion, poverty presents descriptive challenges the way wealth presents descriptive challenges. And it's hard to get a neutral, universally acceptable definition of poverty, as just as impossible, but much less problematic to get a universally acceptable definition of wealth. And so next week, I've run out of time. So next week I will start the lecture off by taking a look at the different ways that sociologists have taken a look at describing poverty, and then move from the description of poverty to the different explanations that have been given for the persistence of poverty in wealthy societies, and that'll lead to describing the main theoretical approaches that are taken up by sociologists to describe and understand social inequality. So I've gone a few minutes over. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to turn off I'm going to turn the recording off here.